To introduce Mr. Abraham Lincoln. He'll give you a little information about himself, his wife Mary over here. We're glad he's here. There was a mix-up last year and couldn't be with us, but they're here this year and we're so proud to have him. So he's going to say some things to us. When he's done, we're going to have a special, and then I've got a short message that'll go along with Mr. Lincoln. How about that? Okay, sir? Good to have you. Let's give Mr. Lincoln a hand.
Good afternoon. As I step up upon this podium so that I can see you and you can see me, and between that arrangement, I think I have a better arrangement. What I'd like to talk about today is, as you know, it's 1863 and this war isn't going away. In 1863, we were into our war for about almost 2.5 years. And we don't seem to be any further ahead than we were 2 years ago. But some of the things that I'd like to recap from this year, and on January 1st, I put in motion the Emancipation Proclamation. Now this was a wartime measure, and what did it actually do for our country? Why did I do this? The basic goal was to change the emphasis of the war from a political issue to a moral issue. As I started the war, I didn't really care if slavery existed or if it existed in the South and not in the North. My goal was to keep the Union together. And a lot of people think that the Civil War started because of states' rights, and that's the Confederate side of the coin, as you may. For me, it was slavery, and I wasn't that sympathetic towards slavery as I have become, because we all change in our courses of our life. So a couple of reasons was to make the emancipation is we, as a North, were faring poorly in our war. The only thing that added up was the amount of casualties and the dead, and it kind of fits into today's sermon about blood, because there was a ton of bloodshed. And I had hoped that by freeing the slaves in the southern states, they would come up to join the North and fight for their own independence. And I think that's kind of working out for our advantage. I also didn't want to free all the slaves, because we have 4 states in our Union that are on the border that may go into the Confederacy. And we can't do that. We can't have that many Confederate states. My goal is to keep the Union together. So that's what I had hoped. Also, France and England were about to declare the Confederacy their own country. And that was not a good thing. We had provided a plan when the war started to kind of choke the South so they couldn't export anything in. At that time, cotton was a big commodity for the South and for our country. We provided 80% of the cotton to the world. England and France wanted it. In exchange for that, the South wanted weapons. So we made this Adirondack plan, which choked all the ports out. And our last cog in our plan was Vicksburg, Mississippi, which General Grant took care of. It took him a while. But between that and Gettysburg, things started swaying in the North's favor. Next in there, we have a couple of battles that are pretty prominent. One is the Battle of Chancellorsville. That was probably the last big Southern victory that they had for General Robert E. Lee. But in that victory at Chancellorsville, he lost his best general. Anybody know what his generals that he lost in Chancellorsville? Yes, sir.
Yes, Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson. And things might have been a little different had he survived that. And you know how he died. He got shot by his own man. And died 6 days later. And he's buried in 2 different places. His arm was buried first, and then he got buried 6 days later. All right, so next, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on Gettysburg. I'm sure you're all familiar with that battle we had about 4 or 5 months ago in Gettysburg. It was July 1st through July 3rd. Started on a Wednesday, and it was a bloodbath. After the battle, there was a lot of dead to contend with, a lot of destruction in the city of Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is not an easy place to get to. And as we know now, it was not the intended battle place. Many people been here to Gettysburg? Anybody? A couple. It's not easy to get here in the future, as I hear, but back then it was even really tough. It's tough terrain to get in there. What they were doing after Chancellorsville, Lee had a lot of confidence for the South. They were feeling very good about themselves, so he decides to come through Maryland into Pennsylvania to attack the North in the North, because most of the battles, practically all of them, were in the South. His army was tired. They were lacking food. Everybody thinks it was for shoes, but there's no shoe factory in Gettysburg. And they were looking to come up through the North if they were successful. They were actually going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to meet there. And if they were successful in Gettysburg, they would go down to Washington and demand their freedom. Well, we know it didn't go that way, which is a good thing. So after I'm going to get into the war a little bit later. Some of the, the governor of Pennsylvania is Andrew Curtin, and he contracted David Wells, who was a lawyer in the city of Gettysburg. And what they did was they purchased 17 acres and hired a man to design a cemetery called the Soldiers National Cemetery. And they were preparing to remove the dead horses and to bury the soldiers' property. And they needed a lot of space to do it, so the 17 acres would do it. And at that time, it was the state's responsibility to bury their own people, but there were so many. As you know, there was around 53,000 fatalities, injured, casualties, wounded, missing from this 3-day battle. It's horrendous. And all the states couldn't do it. So the state of Pennsylvania bought the land, the U.S. government provided the caskets, and now they had to do the dedication. So on September 23rd of this past year, they decided to invite a very famous orator called Edward Everett. And they had planned to do the Gettysburg dedication on October 23rd. It's coming up. But he had to decline it because he says, I'm not prepared to do it. So they moved that date from October 23rd to November 19th. And he would be ready to do his speech. Well, his speech lasted over 2 hours. It was 13,000 and some words, and nobody ever remembers what he said. But if you ever get the chance to read it, what it is like a play. It plays out the story and the events of the 3 days very well. And he memorized all those words. going chronological now, we're into October 3rd. I made 2 proclamations that year. I made the Emancipation. Does anybody know the second proclamation I did? It's a little event held the third Thursday of in November. Thanksgiving. What at the time, each state kind of celebrated Thanksgiving in their own way, not always on the same date. And what I did was I made a proclamation to have it held on the last Thursday of the month. And I hear in the future it's going to get changed to the third Thursday of the month. And that was because during the Depression, Roosevelt made it the third Thursday to give retailers more shopping days till Christmas. But anyway, the Thanksgiving proclamation goes as this. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November as a day of thanksgiving and praise our magnificent Father who dwells in the heavens. So that's when he did it, which was October 3rd of that year. Now, shortly after that, I get a letter from David Wills, and he asked me to say a few remarks about the dedication that's coming up. So it was held on November 19th, like I said, it's Thursday. And I had spent the night before at David Wills' place. He kind of brushed up the speech a little bit. And it was 12 o'clock on the Thursday. Temperature was about like today, kind of like cold and a little damp. But at first, Everett gave his speech for 2 hours. Then there was a little song by the U.S. Marines. And then I got asked to do a speech. And anybody here want to give the speech for me? And I'll see if I can still remember it. It goes like this. I approach the stage, and you can see the empty coffins because all the dead were not properly buried. You could smell the horses, and you can look at it on the fields, and it's pretty awesome. Not good, awesome bad. So I took my place on the stage, and I wish they still would have left the stage there again so you could see the exact spot that I stood at. But anyway, it goes like this. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Now, it's altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow these grounds. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us to be dedicated here to the unfinished task which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us living to be dedicated to the unfinished task that remains before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That this nation under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And then I go back and sit and I think, boy, that speech will never stop. But the next day, I received a little note from Edward Everett. And it said something to the effect like, I wish I could have conveyed in 2 hours what you did in 2 minutes. So he approved of the speech. And obviously the speech has become the most memorized speech in our history. And I think that concludes, I got one more thing. In the Gettysburg battle, our general was George Meade. And he survived it and made the South retreat to the Potomac. Well, just after the battle, they had tremendous rains that came through. Some of the graves were washed open because they weren't dug very deep. And Lee had to sit at the Potomac for about 4 or 5 days. And after I heard this, I sat down and wrote George Meade a letter. And it goes like this. My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and I have closed upon him in connection with the other late successors. Have ended the war. As it is, the war will be prolonged indefinitely. Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am stressed immeasurably because of it. That letter was written on July 14th of 1863. And one of the things I liked about Lincoln is he was very level-headed. He never sent that letter to George Meade. But just the act of writing it out when he was upset saved him a lot of further grief. You know, it wasn't going to change the situation if he sent it to me. So he was a very patient man, and he got along with his credits. And I am very honored to be here today to represent Abraham Lincoln, our first successful Republican president. And it's been a blessing for me to be able to come here today. And I thank Pastor Brown, and I thank you all. Thank you very much.